Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought that I would talk about this little topic and this little conversation that I thought was very particularly interesting. And I had a feeling, all in all, that this topic or this conversation would kind of come overall to the forefront because, this is once again going to be yet again another topic about Tyson the Gypsy King Fury. And as I said in my fight review, which I posted, not too long ago, because of course that fight was last weekend on Saturday, and I thought that it was a very decent performance by Tyson Fury over Dillian White. Tyson Fury, in my opinion, is the clear best and greatest heavyweight of this generation. Now, Tyson Fury, of course, talked about retiring. Do I believe that he is going to retire? It depends on what happens. Maybe if Alexander Usyk ends up defeating that of Anthony Joshua, like I said, maybe Tyson Fury might let it be because I don't know if he's really super duper interested in Alexander Usyk. But if Anthony Joshua does somehow regain the titles, and that is not going to be an easy task for Anthony Joshua if he does face Alexander Usyk in a rematch, it's not going to be an easy task for him at all. Then I think maybe Tyson Fury overall will give it a shot because Tyson Fury, I think he takes a look at Anthony Joshua as a worth it fight because I think he knows that not only is Anthony Joshua, not only is he a decent fighter, but Anthony Joshua and Tyson Fury, it would just do so much money. It would be one of the biggest fights in the world, if not debatably even the biggest fight in all of boxing. Debatably, anyway. But anyways, this conversation overall that I'm going to review by Dante's Boxing Nation, this is going to be a conversation about overall the debate about Tyson Fury and where overall he really truly deserves to be, not only overall within the all-time greats within the heavyweight division, but truly overall within the sport of boxing. The question is about Tyson Fury, and I've already had this conversation a multitude of times. Is he just a great fighter or is he an all-time great fighter? And I truly believe that Tyson Fury, that he's not only a great fighter, I do believe that he is an all-time great fighter. I not only believe that he is one of the greatest heavyweights that I've personally ever seen, I believe that he's also one of the greater and more skilled fighters and more intelligent fighters that I've ever seen. And I do think that Tyson Fury does deserve to be remembered as an all-time great fighter. And some people may think that I'm being a little bit hyperbolic there. Maybe some people think that he does not deserve overall, the title of all-time great fighter. I think that he does. And to be honest with you, I really don't even think that it's that debatable. I don't think that you can have the resume and win the amount of things that Tyson Fury has won in his career, and for him to also be undefeated at this point in time in his career, in my view, and not be called an all-time great fighter. Tyson Fury, in my opinion, is an all-time great fighter. But what's very interesting, and what's also going to come up in this conversation, is going to be Dante's Boxing Nation. And we all know that Dante, that he's not a very big fan of Tyson Fury. But this actually did seem like a video, at least from what I watched, that was a little bit more of his logical and objective side. And that's not usually a side that we see from Dante's Boxing Nation, especially talking about Tyson Fury. Now, I'm sure there will be a few digs or maybe a few points that I'll have to address here and there because Dante probably will not be able to help himself the longer the video goes along. We'll see all in all whatever he says. But Mr. Shakur Stevenson, who of course is one of the more talented fighters in the world, in my opinion, not only that, but one of the best 130-pounders in the world and who also has a very big fight this weekend, he was being filmed, I believe, by the Top Rank crew while watching the Tyson Fury versus the Dillian White fight. And Shakur Stevenson, of course, said something that a lot of people, of course, would look at as somewhat of a controversial statement. And overall, a lot of people probably had their feathers ruffled from this. But basically, Shakur Stevenson said that, more than likely that it was going to be a controversial statement or that people were going to get after him. But he believes that Tyson Fury would more than likely beat that of Muhammad Ali, who, of course, many people, including myself, regard as at least the greatest heavyweight of all time, or at least in that conversation. So the question is about Tyson Fury, at least in this video, what we're going to talk about. Does Tyson Fury overall deserve to be in the same conversation with Muhammad Ali? Is he there yet? Is he not quite there yet? And on top of that, would have Tyson Fury, at least in my opinion, beat that of Muhammad Ali. But anyways, we're going to talk about that in this video. We're going to talk about all that. Just thought that it would be a very interesting conversation. Let's get into it. Let's see what Mr. Dante has to say.
Dante's Boxing Nation, what's going on, guys? So after Tyson Fury, he gets a very impressive knockout win over Dillian White. ESPN, they had a camera crew documenting Shakur Stevenson because they were promoting the Shakur.
That's right. He did get a very dominant knockout win over Dillian White. And that really shows you how much Dante was really hoping and praying for someone like a Dillian White to really defeat a Tyson Fury because he really does not like Tyson Fury whatsoever. He pretty much hates his guts. But maybe there could be a slight realization or a slight possibility that maybe Dante finally realizes, you know what, not only is Tyson Fury a decently great fighter, but he's an all-time great fighter. And it may be somewhat sinking in that, you know what, it's going to be very hard for anyone to defeat Tyson Fury of this era. Because Dante, he was talking all this shit. And, you know, Dante and new media and the LDBC, these channels that talk so much shit and basically say, oh, well, old media should be held accountable for their bad fight predictions and their bad takes. I agree. If you're a person, no matter who you are, no matter what demographic you are, if you're a person that is going to be considered, you know, to be taken seriously, then you have to have logical and objective takes and takes that make sense. And a lot of these takes that these LDBC and new media channels have, they don't make a lick of goddamn sense whatsoever. Dante was claiming all this bullshit, alleging all this shit, basically saying that, don't get me wrong, just because you say that maybe Dillian Whyte can give Tyson Fury a challenge, that's not really an issue. You know, that's not necessarily a bad take. That's not necessarily something. But Dante was alleging all this shit that, oh, Tyson Fury is afraid to face Dillian Whyte because he knows that they sparred, and we know that Dillian Whyte, that, you know, he knocked him down, even though there was really no evidence of that whatsoever. And then what happened? They ended up getting in a fight. Dillian Whyte overall looked out of breath by the 5th or 6th round. Tyson Fury pretty much embarrassed him and out-techniqued him throughout the whole entire fight. Ended up knocking him out with one good solid uppercut in the 6th round, fight over. So like I said, you know, Dante, as well as some of the old media members or some of the other people who have bad takes, he also should be held accountable for some of his bad takes as well. But anyway.
Stevenson versus Oscar Valdez fight. Well, Shakur Stevenson ended up saying something that ESPN liked so much that they decided to make a separate video just about what Shakur Stevenson said. So they actually recorded Shakur Stevenson watching the Tyson Fury fight. Now, before we unpack everything, I want to first start off by telling you guys exactly what Shakur Stevenson said. I'm quoting exactly what he said. He said that Tyson Fury is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And then he said this a couple of times. He said, I know
Tyson Fury is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. I don't think that there's any doubt about that. We all know that if Deontay Wilder was the one that was still undefeated and ended up defeating Tyson Fury in that rematch or in that trilogy match as well, that they would be calling Deontay Wilder one of the greatest heavyweights of all time. Now, I don't think that they would be calling Deontay Wilder necessarily on the Muhammad Ali level, but they were already trying to allege that Deontay Wilder would knock out guys like Mike Tyson, who in my opinion was a decently great heavyweight, just talking about Mike Tyson, but he has been overrated in certain boxing conversations. Because if we're also going to be real about Mike Tyson, then listen, I used to be a very, 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 very big Mike Tyson fan. Mike Tyson was the one overall that ended up getting me into boxing because Mike Tyson pretty much was a celebrity, you know, while I was growing up, even though I didn't really get to watch him in professional boxing because I was not really, you know, around, or I was way too young when he was boxing professionally. But anyways, you know, bottom line is this. Mike Tyson is a person to where, you know, so many people, they put him in such great renown. They always say that he's debatably the greatest heavyweight of all time. To be honest with you, Mike Tyson, even though I do believe that he is a great fighter, can we really even label Mike Tyson as an all-time great fighter? Because if we're really going to go there about Mike Tyson in pretty much every big pressure fight that he was in against the real debatable A-grade fighters, not only did he lose, the fights really were not even remotely close. And I'm not even really talking about the fights against Buster Douglas, but when you lost to Lennox Lewis, you lost dominantly. When you lost to Evander Holyfield, you lost dominantly. So it just is what it is. I'm sorry, but Mike Tyson, he just can't be in those same conversations as some of the greatest heavyweights of all time. And just to talk about Tyson Fury really quickly, I would not say that he is the greatest, you know, the greatest heavyweight of all time, at least from my perspective, because I don't think that there's enough to prove that. Even if, you know, Tyson Fury, let's say, even if he did defeat Alexander Usyk or Anthony Joshua, well, if he defeated those two to add on to his record, maybe then you could debate that he's in that same conversation. Because Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk, they're the best fighters remaining that Tyson Fury really has not beat yet. And if he retired undefeated, then yes, you could probably put him in that conversation. But right now, I don't know if I would necessarily put Tyson Fury in that conversation, just because if we compare him to Lennox Lewis and Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, to be fair to him, even though he did have 2 losses in his career, you know, Lennox Lewis overall does have a debate as the greatest heavyweight of all time, in my view, because he overall was able to unify, I believe, if not all the titles, most of the titles last time he was around. He defeated names like a Mike Tyson, even though he wasn't at the best point in his career. He also defeated Evander Holyfield. He also defeated, I believe, Andrew Golota. He defeated a multitude of other very, very decent fighters. He also defeated the great Vitaly Klitschko, I believe was his name. You know, the older brother, I believe, of Vladimir Klitschko in his last remaining fight. So Lennox Lewis, of course, is in that debatable conversation. Another heavyweight, in my view, at least for the day, that deserves to be in that conversation is Rocky Marciano. And a certain amount of people, they say, well, why would you put Rocky Marciano in that conversation? Because Rocky Marciano was the greatest heavyweight of his day. And listen, that's not me saying that he was fighting Mike Tyson or Evander Holyfield, but for the day, he was beating fighters overall that pretty much were his own same size, sometimes even way bigger than him. A lot of people overall don't realize that about Rocky Marciano. Rocky Marciano had a 67-inch reach, and he was sometimes beating guys that had like a 10-inch reach advantage over him, like I believe Jersey Joe Walcott. He also defeated Archie Moore, I believe, who was, he was old at the time, older anyway, but he was still knocking people out. He still overall was a very, very good dude when Rocky Marciano beat him. He did beat Joe Louis at the older end of his career, but if we're also going to compare, for example, like if you're one of those guys, or if you're one of those people that say that Floyd deserves to be over Manny Pacquiao because Floyd's, record was spotless, and Manny Pacquiao, all in all, he did end up losing some fights, then we would also have to keep that same energy with Rocky Marciano and Joe Louis. Joe Louis lost, I believe, to Jersey Joe Walcott or one of the other black fighters of the day, I believe. He also lost to Max Schmeling by knockout in the first fight. Rocky Marciano's career was spotless. He was undefeated. All right, so it is what it is. So Rocky Marciano, even though I'm not claiming him to be the most pure boxer that I ever saw, he does deserve to be in that conversation. Now, would I put Tyson Fury in that same conversation with those three? Not quite, but what I will say is this. I think that he's right below them. If we were to put Tyson Fury in the same conversation with the Joe Frazier's and the George Foremans and the Evander Holyfields, I think, to be quite honest with you, I think that he's right there. So I can't necessarily put him in that tier 1, that tier A of all-time great heavyweights that I've seen, but he would be in that tier B. And a certain amount of people, they would heavily disagree with that. But listen, just being logical and objective, you can tell that Tyson Fury is an all-time great fighter. All-time great fighter. And he defeated Deontay Wilder, who would be a future first ballot Hall of Famer. He defeated Dillian White, although he's never really won an official belt. He has defeated some very, very decent fighters. He also ended up defeating Derek Chisora, who isn't really a Hall of Famer in my opinion, but he was a very decently tough, prospect at one point in time, or tough gatekeeper. And then, of course, he defeated the obvious first ballot all-time great Hall of Famer, Vladimir Klitschko, and he dominated him. He embarrassed him. So Tyson Fury, very clearly, all-time great heavyweight. And in my view, Tyson Fury would probably be in that same ranking right now as certain fighters that I put anywhere from that top 30, top 40 range. Certain fighters like a Tommy Hearn, certain fighters overall like an Andre Ward, a Joe Calzaghe, a Bernard Hopkins, certain fighters like that.
I'm supposed to stand by my people, but we have to give credit when credit is due. He continued by saying, I know this is going to make some people angry, but Tyson Fury beats Muhammad Ali. He said Tyson Fury is 6'9" and he's 300 pounds. How is Muhammad Ali going to hit him? What, is he going to start fighting like Joe Frazier? Tyson Fury is too big for anybody. How is Muhammad Ali going to get inside? And as he says this, he's having a conversation with someone in the room, and clearly it sounds like they're already starting to debate with him because he says, I know.
Let me address that overall really quickly. If you're asking my personal opinion, do I believe that Tyson Fury would beat a prime Muhammad Ali? Well, if we're comparing them, they're in the same size, it's very possible. Because Tyson Fury as a person, listen, I'm just going to state this, because a lot of people, of course, they view athletes as gods when it comes down to it. I don't personally do that. I'm not a person that loves to fanboy over people. I just like to give a logical and objective analysis. I'm not stating that Tyson Fury is greater than Muhammad Ali, because I don't think that there's enough to prove that. But what I will say is this. I think that Tyson Fury would have gave any heavyweight in the history of boxing a hell of a time. I don't think that there's any debate about that. Tyson Fury is a dude that is 6'9". He can weigh up almost nearly 300 pounds. He can move extraordinarily well for his size. He has very quick feet, very fast hands, decent punching power, maybe even A-grade punching power, at least on the A- level when he's at his best. He has very high fighting IQ. He can fight going forward, fight going backward. He's a very multi-dimensional fighter, very, very confident within himself, very decent chin when it comes down to a great heart. Tyson Fury would have been a force for anyone in the heavyweight division, in my opinion. Anyone from Muhammad Ali, Lennox Lewis, Rocky Marciano. Rocky, really, to be quite honest with you, was probably a natural light heavyweight, but that's just how the heavyweights were back then. because they're really around 185 usually, unless you were someone like a Joe Louis who was decently heavier. But, when it comes down to it, any heavyweight within the history, just in terms of skill v skill or toughness, Tyson Fury would have been able to compete with anyone in my view. So, I always see these comments, especially when it comes to newer fighters or newer athletes. They always say, "Oh, you can never compare this guy to this guy." Well, a lot of the times, that's just people overall, not wanting their athletes overall that are their favorites, that they look at as like a godlike level. They don't want them to eventually be surpassed. Listen, the truth is about Tyson Fury is that would I put him as the greatest heavyweight of all time at the current moment? No, I would not. But Tyson Fury is a person to where he is skilled enough and intelligent enough and a great enough athlete to where he would have gave any fighter throughout the heavyweights history a very, very tough time.
I know. And then he ends it by saying, I know Muhammad Ali is quote unquote, I'm throwing in the quotes. He says, I know that Muhammad Ali is quote unquote the greatest, but man. Now, before I respond to every single thing Shakur Stevenson just said, regardless if you think what he just said was ridiculous or you completely agree, to all of the non-black boxing fans listening to this video right now, the way we just seen Shakur Stevenson praising Tyson Fury, how come we have never seen any of you non-black boxing fans and old media members praise any black fighter the same way? In other words,
with Shakur Stevenson, even though he may be a boxing fan as well, he's a black fighter. So it is what it is. He's not really a boxing fan, at least from this perspective. I mean, he probably is as well. But you're talking about fans. Shakur Stevenson is a fighter. And if we're talking about fighters, Tyson Fury gave Dante Wilder a great amount of credit. If we're also talking about fighters, Canelo Alvarez gave, Floyd Mayweather Jr. a great amount of credit. Even though, of course, he did state that today he believes that they would knock him out. But, you expect that from someone from Canelo because Canelo believes that now that he's a greater fighter than what he ever was and that he is the true number one pound for pound fighter. So that's not really overall that big of a deal to me. But, Dante, he always bitches about how, these certain fans of other demographics, how they never compliment black fighters. And listen, I get it to a degree. Do black fighters sometimes get the shit end of the stick? No doubt about it. I don't think there's any debating that. But listen, at the end of the day, Dante, like I said, and I said this about the Boxing Ego video that I did, I believe a couple of days ago. I think it was on Monday. Whatever energy you put out there is the energy more than likely you're going to get back. And Dante is not a person that 90% of the time is logical and objective. He usually spends 90% of his time trying to tear down overall the fighters that have a different complexion than that of the black American fighters. That's why he hates Canelo Alvarez. He hated Gennady Golovkin. He doesn't like Tyson Fury that much. He didn't like Vasily Lomachenko that much. Not saying that he won't give him credit here and there, but he will, in a way, especially if they are the threat to the number one pound for pound spot, he will try to tear them down.
How come this type of respect Shakur Stevenson is showing is never reciprocated when it comes to black boxers? I mean, just think about it. When is the last time you've heard any boxing analyst from DAZN to ESPN, Chris Mannix, Max Kellerman, or anyone else in old media today, when have you ever heard them say anything close about a black boxer if he had beat someone who was not black?
Right, Dante, I understand your point, but let's really think about all the black analysts out there. Let's think about someone overall like a Roy Jones Jr. Let's think about someone overall like Andre Ward. Has Andre Ward been, at the top of the mountain, basically saying that Vasily Lomachenko, that he's the number one pound for pound fighter? Have certain black fighters or analysts, basically always been on the side of other demographic of fighters? No, not always. So cut the bullshit. It just is what it is. Now don't get me wrong. When it comes down to, could you make the case that, certain analysts that, they could show more respect towards black fighters? No doubt about it. I'm not necessarily arguing that, but Dante always tries to make this bullshit point about how these black analysts all the time, or these black fighters, how they're so magnanimous, or they're so much nicer overall to other demographics than what they are to them. That's a bunch of horse shit, and we know it. It just is what it is. Not only does DontesBoxingNation spend his time on a daily basis, usually, tearing down other fighters, but we've seen Shakur Stevenson do it. We've seen Devin Haney do it. We've seen overall, Terrence Crawford to a degree do it, and a certain amount of other fighters do it. All right, so it is what it is. Don't get me wrong. That's not me saying that they won't give credit where credit is due here and there. But a lot of the time, certain black analysts or black fighters, they'll tear down other demographics too. So it just is what it is.
We're not talking about going all the way back and telling someone, oh, one of my favorite fighters is Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson. That doesn't count. We're talking about today. We're talking about someone doing exactly what Shakur Stevenson just did. That is a rhetorical question because we know what time it is. With that being said, now let's go ahead and unpack every single thing that Shakur Stevenson just said. Shakur, he said to Tyson Fury, he's 6'9" and he's 300 pounds. Actually, Tyson Fury was 264 pounds, and Dillian White was 250.
Yes, but basically, you know what he means, Dante. What Shakur Stevenson is saying is that Tyson Fury, when he's at his max weight, he's a person all in all that can weigh up almost to 300 pounds. And he moves extraordinarily well for his size, and he has an 85-inch reach. There's not a lot of fighters that would be able to compete with that.
3 pounds. So Tyson Fury had an 11-pound weight advantage over Dillian White and a 5-inch height advantage over White. So actually, if Tyson Fury would have weighed in close to 300 pounds to fight Dillian White, he would have actually gave Dillian White his best chance of pulling off an upset because Tyson Fury would have been more of a stationary target.
Well, I agree with that to a degree. I'm not going to say that Tyson Fury would have been a stationary target because I don't think that Tyson Fury is ever really a stationary target. I don't think that he's ever been a stationary target. I think that maybe in the third fight against Wilder, that after the third round that he underestimated him a little bit, but he was good enough and, you know, had his senses enough to where he was still able to beat him quite thoroughly. But Tyson Fury, you know, of course, if he wants to be a little bit quicker, especially on his feet, then yes, he's probably going to weigh somewhere around 260, 270.
It's like he was in the third fight against Dante.
And keep in mind, this is the same idiot, DontesBoxingNation, that claimed, I believe a week before the fight, that, you know, Tyson Fury always has a hard time getting into shape and he wants to retire from boxing because, you know, he can't take it anymore. Like, look at his love handles. But Dante really don't know shit about boxing anyway. Tyson Fury, he's not one of those guys. He's not one of those fighters that you can take a look at his physique, at the love handles, and basically say, oh, well, that guy must not have great conditioning. Because if you take a look at Tyson Fury in any fight, Tyson Fury never runs out of energy. He never runs out of stamina. Tyson Fury's stamina goes for rounds and rounds and rounds and rounds. There's never been one fight out there where I've seen Tyson Fury be dead dog tired. Never.
Say Wilder. And Dillian White is one of the hardest punchers in the heavyweight division. Okay, so then Shakur Stevenson, he says, how would Muhammad Ali get on the inside because of how tall Tyson Fury is, right? You know, it kind of surprises me to hear Shakur.
Well, what Muhammad Ali, in my opinion, would have to do is that he would have to keep his guard up overall a decent amount of the time in that fight. He would probably have to try to launch a body attack to Tyson Fury. Probably overall would have to use that speed and use his jab. One thing I will say about Muhammad Ali is this, though. There were certain times where he did get hit with shots that maybe he shouldn't have because he relied so much on his reflexes and athleticism and his speed because Muhammad Ali was, you know, very, very quick, extraordinarily quick, you know, for a heavyweight.
Stevenson say this in particular because Shakur Stevenson is arguably the most skilled fighter, at least when it comes to future pound-for-pound fighters. Shakur Stevenson is arguably the most skilled fighter in boxing. And as long as he's given the opportunity.
Well, I understand where you're coming from, Dante, but, you know, I don't necessarily have a problem with Dante saying that, but I'm going to say, you know, slow your roll or slow that down a little bit, at least until we see Shakur Stevenson, if he can even get past Oscar Valdez first. You know, once again, people were saying that about Vasily Lomachenko, and Dante and these guys are basically saying that he was overrated because of the complexion for the protection. You know, but once again, with a fighter like Shakur Stevenson, they have no issue. So, you know, it is what it is. Anyway.
He will most likely become, number one, the best fighter in the world. So to hear him say that, it surprises me a little bit because Mike Tyson, he beat heavyweight champions in other heavyweights that had a 6 and even 7-inch height over him. So if Shakur is impressed with Tyson Fury, he must really be impressed with Mike Tyson. David Haye,
Right, but Mike Tyson never defeated a true A-grade fighter in their prime in his career. Do I believe that Mike Tyson 100% would have beat Tyson Fury? I think that, you know, the fight could have went either way. But Tyson Fury, and a lot of people are not going to agree with me on this one, but it just is what it is. Tyson Fury has to be remembered as a greater heavyweight and a greater fighter than what than what overall Mike Tyson was. Why? Because Mike Tyson could not defeat any of the true greats during his day. He just couldn't. It is what it is. Yes, he was unified during the 80s. You know, he was the baddest man on the planet during the 80s. But how many of those fighters do we truly remember as all-time great fighters? Not one. I mean, what, fighters like Tony Tucker and James Tillis? Like, give me a break.
Moved up from cruiserweight, and he beat the heavyweight champion at the time, the 7-foot tall, 315 pounds, Nikolai Valuev. Not only did
Well, that's great, but Nikolai Valuev, he's not really that great of a fighter. And you know that overall, Dante. Come on. Let's not play dumb here. I mean, don't get me wrong. Dante is not the sharpest tool. He's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. But anyways, when it comes out, he knows overall what Shakur means. What Shakur Stevenson is basically saying is that not only with Tyson Fury's size, but with his skill set, Muhammad Ali would have had a hell of a time. And, you know, Tyson Fury, it's almost kind of like John Jones when you take a look at the UFC. Not only is John Jones like 6'5" and he has an 83-inch reach, but he's extraordinarily gifted. He's extraordinarily well-balanced and talented and multi-dimensional. So it's almost nearly impossible to beat him, especially if you're not his own same size.
Valuev have a 7-inch height advantage over David Haye, but he outweighed him.
But one thing I'll say about Tyson Fury is this: even if he went up against people that were similar in size to him, like a Vladimir Klitschko or Deontay Wilder, he still pretty much thoroughly embarrassed them.
By nearly 100 pounds. One website, they wrote an article that was entitled David Haye versus Nikolai Valuev, Statistics of a Boxing Mismatch. Now, let me just make this clear.
Right, but with the Muhammad Ali versus Tyson Fury, it ended up very similar because, don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that Muhammad Ali would have no chance against Tyson Fury. I'm not saying that Tyson Fury would 100% beat Ali, but Tyson Fury would be a hell of a matchup for anyone out there. And the reason why that is because Tyson Fury not only is so big with his size, but he's extraordinarily gifted athletically. He's also a person that is very, very talented, very, 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 smart, ability in the boxing ring, very high boxing IQ, excellent jab, excellent feet for his size, Tyson Fury is just someone that you don't want to mess around with.
This video is not...
So basically Dante's point of saying, well, just because Tyson Fury is bigger, there's been certain guys that have beaten, bigger heavyweights before. Yeah, but when Mike Tyson was defeating guys that outreached him by several inches, let's be real, those guys were not elite fighters. And Nikolai Valuev or whatever, even though he was a champion, I believe, at one point in time in his career, go ahead and look at Valuev versus Evander Holyfield when he was like 40. That would tell you all you need to know about Nikolai Valuev. Valuev was not really that more talented of a fighter. He certainly was nowhere near Tyson Fury, not even close.
Really focused on debating fantasy matches like Tyson Fury versus Muhammad Ali. It's more about presenting the statistical facts. When it comes to fighters that had massive height advantages and weight advantages and still lost. Muhammad Ali, who was 6'3", the tallest opponent he faced was former heavyweight champion Ernie Terrell, who was 6'6". But we do have to mention the point that just like everything else does in the world, the sport of boxing evolves. So if you are talking about fantasy matches like Tyson Fury versus Muhammad Ali, you have to keep in mind the Muhammad Ali that we know from the 60s, if he was fighting today, there's no doubt about it, he would be better because the fighters today, they train different. The opponents today are far more versatile. And with a fighter like Muhammad Ali, who was already ahead.
Well, I'm not going to say the opponents today are far more versatile, at least in the heavyweight division, but I do think that this is a talented heavyweight era. I think that the point that Dante is bringing up is one of value. I think all in all that it is a decent point, but it's just so interesting now all of a sudden that Tyson Fury versus Muhammad Ali gets brought into the conversation. He says, well, let's take a look over at the history. Times have changed, but if you were to compare it to Muhammad Ali and Floyd Mayweather, a fighter that he wants to be remembered as the clear greatest of all time, especially because he has no losses, then he'll compare Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s and Muhammad Ali's skill sets, even though they're in two completely different weight classes and they're separated by a good 40 plus years. But anyway.
This time, you could already...
Or at least a good solid... I'm trying to think when did Muhammad Ali retire. Maybe it was at the late 70s. I can't remember. And then Floyd, of course, he began boxing in the 90s, but you know what I mean.
Imagine how well he would have adjusted. Now, let's touch on when Shakur Stevenson, he repeatedly said, I stand with my people, But I got to be real. I got to tell the truth when it comes to this situation. I want to make it very clear to everyone. It's never really been about standing with your people. It's about speaking the truth. It's about...
Well, I agree with you, Dante, but then that makes you somewhat of a hypocrite because that's all you do. It just is what it is. That's basically all your channel is about. You don't speak the truth 75% of the time. It just is what it is.
The whole truth. So I don't expect Shakur Stevenson to say anything just based on standing by his people.
That's why you went with Deontay Wilder and on this cheating allegation bullshit with the Tyson Fury thing. That's why you criticize Canelo Alvarez to this day because you don't like him. That's why you criticize Vasily Lomachenko, Gennady Triple G Golovkin, and tried to tear down those fighters. All those narratives that you pushed out there were basically overall for you to push basically your pro-racial agenda.
Sure.
And don't get me wrong, like I said, there's such a thing as, complexion for the protection fighters, and certain fighters all know that maybe get more protected than that of black fighters. Yes, absolutely. But like I said, we have to discern, fighters, or the difference between a fighter that is just getting hyped up because they're a great white hype, quote unquote, or a fighter that is an all-time great fighter. And Dante, the majority of the time, he overall does not have his facts straight.
We may hear a lot of Mexican boxers, when you ask them, who do you think is going to win? And the first thing they say is, look, man, I'm Mexican, so I got to go with the Mexican. And it's nothing wrong with them saying that. I have no problem with them saying that at all. But speaking the truth, it has nothing to do with sticking by your own people. So giving someone credit for a win that they deserve credit for, that's what you're supposed to do.
I agree, and that's what you do about 15% of the time, especially when it comes to fighters that you don't like.
Problem is, in the sport of boxing, the only time that's not done is when it's a black fighter, especially when he's beating someone who's not black.
I understand your point to a degree, Dante, but don't bitch and moan about other channels or other sports analysts not giving credit overall to certain fighters when we know damn well, for any of us that have paid attention to the history of your channel, you don't give credit to a lot of fighters that you don't like. You barely gave any credit to Tyson Fury. You barely give any credit to Canelo Alvarez. You always try to tear him down to this day. You tried to diminish Vasily Lomachenko when he was looked at as the #1 pound-for-pound fighter. You called Gennady Golovkin the most overrated fighter, not even just of the decade, but of all time. So come on, cut the bullshit. It is what it is. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand, Dante, what you're saying. But if you're going to bitch and moan overall about double standards against black fighters, then guess what? It should be your job overall to be objective and logical towards everybody. All right, you should set an example. But the only example that you set overall is that you're a part of a pro-black cult known as New Media, or the LDBC.
Shakur Stevenson said, I believe that I would beat Canelo Alvarez if we were in the same weight class. I would do the same thing that Floyd Mayweather did. Shakur didn't say that because he was trying to stick with his people. He said that because that's what he truly believes.
Well, Shakur Stevenson probably did say that because that's what he truly believed, because Shakur Stevenson believes that later on in the future, and not too far away from now, that he will be the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world. And if you're a boxer, on the level of a Shakur Stevenson especially, you should believe that, so there's really no problem with that. I don't have a problem with what Shakur Stevenson said.
That because it logically made sense if you have been paying attention to Canelo Alvarez's career. We've seen Canelo Alvarez get outboxed by fighters like Caleb Plant, Billy Joe Saunders, an old faded Sergey.
No, we didn't see him get outboxed by those fighters. We've seen some of those fighters, and here we go, Dante showing overall his true nature once again, especially tearing down Canelo Alvarez, especially because Canelo is the main threat. He's the main #1 pound-for-pound fighter today in the world of boxing, and he knows that. So, no, we did not see Canelo Alvarez realistically get outboxed by those guys. You tried to spread that narrative because you want to make it seem like Canelo Alvarez is a very limited fighter, when in all actuality, Canelo Alvarez, although every fighter to some degree has somewhat of limitations here and there, Canelo Alvarez is a very, very great fighter, all-time great fighter. No, he was not getting outboxed by Billy Joe Saunders or Sergey Kovalev or Caleb Plant. Now, can you argue that there were certain rounds that he lost? Yes, of course. But at the end of the day, Canelo not only ended up stopping all those fighters, he was winning every single one of those fights.
Kovalev. To, of course, Floyd Mayweather the Great, and even Edislani.
And once again, it's very interesting overall when Dante says that old faded Sergey Kovalev, who still was a champion in the sport of boxing. Now, don't get me wrong. Was Sergey Kovalev the same Crusher Kovalev that fought Andre Ward? No, he was not. But he still overall was a very, very decent fighter. He was coming off of 2 great victories two great victories over two of the top 10 contenders, even one of the top 5 guys, I believe, overall within the light heavyweight division. It's not like he was just coming off of 2 knockout losses. All right, no, don't get me wrong. He was knocked out a couple of times by the time that Canelo had fought him, but he still was an A-grade opponent, at least on the A- level. But it's funny because when Terrence Crawford, who he wants to push as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter, when he fought Kell Brook, who was never going to have a chance to be a champion ever again because he overall was way, way, way wore down at that point in time in his career. He was never looked at as the same after the Errol Spence Jr. loss especially, and also Amir Khan, who had already been knocked out 3 separate times in his career, also had no chance of winning another belt in his career. All of a sudden, those are elite wins. So once again, cut the bullshit.
And even Amir Khan. And we already know, if we're being honest deep down, that the majority of those names that I just mentioned.
The Arasani Lara fight was a very, very decent fight. It was very, very decently close. In my view, you could argue that fight could have went either way. But Arasani Lara did give Canelo Alvarez a great amount of problems. But that's because Arasani Lara, he was an extraordinary fighter during his prime. Probably the best Cuban fighter that I've at least ever personally seen during my time. So it is what it is. Anyway.
They didn't have half the skill that a Shakur Stevenson has. Sticking with your people.
Well, I don't know if I would say that because you also mentioned Floyd Mayweather Jr. in that same conversation. But Arasani Lara was an extraordinarily skilled fighter. Once again, let's wait overall before we really call Shakur Stevenson the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world of boxing, or at least the future number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. I understand what you're saying, but let's wait a little bit until we see some results.
Oh.
And even with Shakur Stevenson's talent, I still don't think that it's fair overall to say that those opponents that you just mentioned, that they didn't have to have half the talent. Now, if maybe you want to mention someone like Amir Khan or something like that, maybe that would make sense because Amir, even though he was decently talented, he had a lot of faults in his style, including that chin that was made out of, fucking plaster wrap. But when it comes down to it all in all, basically a lot of those other fighters that you mentioned, like Arasani Lara, he was a very, very high skill level fighter. Very, very high skill level fighter.
Is when someone asks you to give them a prediction or an analytical breakdown, and your only response is, well, you know what, I'm Mexican, so I got to go with the Mexican. If I tell you right now that Shakur Stevenson is one of the very few that has...
So then basically what you're telling me is that your analysis is based on what you truly think. And a lot of your analysis overall in fights are usually pretty much wrong. Like the Tyson Fury, Deontay Wilder fight breakdown, and maybe the Erickson Lubin versus Sebastian Fundora fight. So basically what you're telling us is that you're an idiot. Anyway.
The potential to not only be pound for pound one of the best fighters in the world, but pound for pound number 1, the best fighter in the world, the pound for pound king. That statement has nothing to...
What I'll say is this, Shakur Stevenson, I certainly understand what DontesBoxingNation is saying there. What I'll say is this, Shakur Stevenson, in my view, kind of like when I seen Vasily Lomachenko on the rise, although, at the time, I could not put him as the number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. Just like when Teddy Atlas stated that Vasily Lomachenko maybe later on could eventually become the future number 1 pound-for-pound fighter. And of course, these channels like Dante, they got all offended by that, but all of a sudden they have no problem, promoting Shakur that way. And listen, whatever. You do whatever you want to do. Listen, what I'll say is this. I certainly understand what DontesBoxingNation is trying to say. And is there maybe a little bit, of accuracy to what he's saying? Certainly, it could be, because Shakur Stevenson, he's an extraordinary fighter. But he does have to get past Oscar Valdez. And Oscar Valdez, it may not be as easy as a test as what some people overall are going to, to think. But we'll see.
Do with the people that you stick with. If you're not a racist and you're paying attention to everything that Shakur is doing in the ring, then everyone could see his potential. Almost.
I agree with you, Dante, but that's why you tear down certain fighters like Vasily Lomachenko and Tyson Fury and Gennady Golovkin and Canelo Alvarez, even when it's far to call them a lot of the times very limited fighters besides Vasily Lomachenko. So it is what it is. So cut the bullshit, like I said, if you're not a racist. Dante, you're the pot calling the kettle black. You're one of the biggest racists out here. It is what it is.
Every boxing fan can see that Shakur Stevenson is on another level compared to a lot of...
I agree. If you have a logical, intelligence, and overall objective mindset, and if you don't just pander according to race. Now, don't get me wrong, that's not me saying that you don't cheer for your own or that you're not hoping for maybe this fighter to win overall because, you cheer for your own. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not criticizing anyone who does that. Am I a person that necessarily does that? No, not necessarily. I mean, I'm not saying overall that I don't cheer for my own to a degree, but I'm not usually a person overall that just flat out says, "Oh, I really hope this guy wins because I hate this other guy." I'm not usually a guy that does that. I don't have very big emotional attachments overall, to these type of things because I try to look at things always from an analytical and logical perspective, at least especially in the world of sports.
Other fighter.
And yes, if you're a person that is logical and objective, you can tell that Shakur Stevenson that he is an extraordinary talent.
Now, last but not least, let's talk about Shakur Stevenson saying that Tyson Fury is one of the greatest fighters of all time. The first thing I will say is there's no doubt about it. Tyson Fury is the most accomplished heavyweight in the division right now because he beat Deontay Wilder and because Anthony Joshua, he just lost. Now, of course, we don't know what's going to happen in the rematch with Usyk, but that definitely makes Tyson Fury the most accomplished right now. But there's still way too much unfinished business to say he's the best of this era. I mean, because we can't.
No, I don't think that there's much more unfinished business at all to call him the best heavyweight of this era. Tyson Fury could retire today and he could be known as the best heavyweight of this era. Do you think that Andre Ward was not the best 168 or 175 pounder of his era because he never fought Adonis Stevenson or he never overall fought David Benavidez? That's always so funny. They always call Andre Ward this all-time great fighter, and he was an all-time great fighter. This is not me disrespecting Andre Ward, but they always call Andre Ward an all-time great fighter. He never fought the elite black fighter in Adonis Stevenson at the 175-pound division. He could have fought Adonis Stevenson. Instead, he decided to retire after he fought Sergey the Crusher Kovalev. All of a sudden, then, Sergey the Crusher Kovalev is this elite Caucasian fighter. But, it is what it is. But don't get me wrong, Andre Ward was an all-time great fighter. That's kind of the same level where I have Tyson Fury. There is a little bit of unfinished business, but kind of like in the Andre Ward situation, if Tyson Fury retired today, he very clearly not only would be the best heavyweight of this era, he would be the greatest, at least in my opinion. Now, some people may ask me, what about Alexander Usyk? Well, Alexander Usyk, even though he's a very decent heavyweight, or he's a very decent fighter, he's only really had one big win there, and that's against Anthony Joshua. And that was against a great fighter, but a fighter all in all that proved to us that he is beatable. So it is what it is. At least when Tyson Fury defeated Vladimir Klitschko, yes, Vladimir Klitschko already had multiple losses, but he had not lost in almost nearly a decade. So Tyson Fury completely embarrassed him when he was at his best. He overall embarrassed Deontay Wilder when he was undefeated, and he also defeated Dillian Whyte when he was at the best point in his career. So we have to give Tyson Fury a lot of credit.
You can't just give Tyson Fury credit for fights that he didn't take. And we also can't give him credit for beating Muhammad Ali in fantasy matches. Speaking of Muhammad Ali, Shakur Stevenson, he said that Tyson Fury is one of the greatest fighters of all time, but then he said
he is one of the greatest fighters of all time, and I don't think that there's any doubt about that. If you're a person that is logical and objective, and overall you know what you're talking about in boxing, if you're worth if you're worth your salt when it comes to boxing commentary, you know that Tyson Fury is a decently great fighter. Not even just a decently great fighter. Let me put it overall, in a better perspective. He's an all-time great fighter.
Beats Muhammad Ali. So the question is, who does Shakur Stevenson believes is the greatest fighter of all time? Because if he's saying
he probably believes that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the greatest fighter of all time. Would not surprise me because more than likely, I can't remember overall his age, but I believe that he's in his early 20s, somewhere around there. So Shakur Stevenson, he probably believes that Floyd Mayweather Jr. is the greatest of all time. He probably grew up watching him.
Once again, Tyson is one of, but beats Muhammad Ali. That means Shakur is saying that someone else is the greatest fighter of all time. And it's obviously not Muhammad Ali or Tyson Fury. Now, remember earlier in this video, I said that Shakur Stevenson, he said, and I told you, I added the quotes, because whenever people talk about Muhammad Ali, they always say, yeah, Muhammad Ali's the greatest. But we usually say that because that's what Muhammad Ali called himself. He called himself the greatest. Now,
well, what I'll say about Muhammad Ali is that even though, some people would debate that he is the greatest, some people would debate that he isn't. Listen, it's up to you. But at the end of the day, Muhammad Ali, to me, he's at least in the conversation with anyone out there because he is at least in that conversation for being the greatest heavyweight of all time, especially for his day. I believe fighting in the 60s and 70s, he was way ahead of his time. And he was able to win over juggernauts, at least debatably, or very skilled fighters for the day, like, Joe Frazier, George Foreman, Sonny Liston, even though Sonny Liston, of course, compared to the 90s or maybe even today. He doesn't look as skilled as some of the fighters maybe, but he still overall was great for the day. So we have to give Muhammad Ali a great amount of credit.
If we're comparing Tyson Fury to Muhammad Ali, if you were to tell somebody that Tyson Fury was the greatest and they were to ask you, well, who did he beat? What makes him the greatest? When it comes to Muhammad Ali, we know what made Muhammad Ali either the greatest or one of the greatest is the fact that he beat Sonny Liston. He beat Joe Frazier in the best of three. And one of the hardest things he did was beating a young, undefeated lion in George Foreman. You often hear boxers say,
I'll agree with Dante's point there. I think that, that's a very good point by him, where basically I don't think that we can really put Tyson Fury in that same conversation with Ali because maybe he just did not accomplish as much as what he did, but Tyson Fury is great in his own right. Like I said, he's in that tier 2 for me right now, not in the tier 1. For him to be in that tier 1, he would have to beat Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk, in my opinion, but we'll see what ends up happening there, or at least the winner of that rematch, but we'll see what happens. But Muhammad Ali, yes, he defeated Joe Frazier, Ken Norton, I believe. He also defeated Sonny Liston, Floyd Patterson, George Foreman. Is there another fighter that I'm forgetting here? Maybe not. I don't know. But probably a few other fighters that I'm not listening at the moment. So yes, Muhammad Ali, he defeated pretty much every other great of his generation, at least when he was at, somewhat of the best years. Or his best years.
Easier to win the titles than it is to keep them. And we've seen a lot of the great heavyweights, from Muhammad Ali to Lennox Lewis, and even the Klitschko brothers, win the title and defend the title against young, dangerous, undefeated.
Well, the Klitschko brothers are not on the same level as the Tyson Fury. And I know a lot of people, they're going to disagree with me on that. And basically what that's telling me is that he's basically saying that Tyson Fury is not even a top 10 heavyweight of all time, which is a load of shit. Tyson Fury is greater than a lot of other heavyweights that I know overall throughout history. Like I said, he would be overall in that tier 2 range. All right? That's just overall where I put him. The Klitschko brothers were great fighters, but Vladimir Klitschko especially, I mean, come on, let's just be real. How many fighters can we really remember from the Vladimir Klitschko era to where we say, oh my God, those guys are really all-time great threats? Not a whole lot, right? Not a whole lot. No offense to Vladimir Klitschko, but that era overall was so weak, usually compared to some of the other heavyweight fighters, or some of the other heavyweight eras, excuse me.
Heavyweight prospects. So since we know who Muhammad Ali beat, what are you going to say if someone asks you, who did Tyson Fury beat? And you're going to obviously say Deontay Wilder. He beat Deontay Wilder and he beat
Well, Tyson Fury ended up defeating 2 all-time great fighters, or at least to a degree, 2 great fighters, 2 future First Ballot Hall of Fame fighters, undoubtedly. Let's say overall when we talk about Vladimir Klitschko, he certainly is a First Ballot Hall of Famer, debatably a top 10 heavyweight of all time. Now, do I think that his competition during the day was the best? No, but it's very clear that Vladimir Klitschko, both the Klitschko brothers, were at least decently talented, very physically imposing, and very overall talented and skillful fighters, for the day. So we have to give Tyson Fury credit for that. He pretty much thoroughly outboxed Vladimir Klitschko and embarrassed him. He also defeated Dillian White, who maybe, if you wanted to compare, maybe that's like the Ken Norton overall of Tyson Fury's resume, I guess, if you wanted to debate that. Someone that was a decently talented fighter, but not on the same level as a Frazier or Foreman or a Liston. And then, of course, you have Deontay Wilder, who some would debate is the second greatest heavyweight of this era. I would say that he's around anywhere from second to third when it comes down to, depending also on what Anthony Joshua and Alexander Usyk do within this generation. But we'll end up seeing what happens there. But Tyson Fury has very clearly defeated some very decently great fighters. That's not me saying that, he has just, repeated a great fighter after repeated a great fighter after repeated a great fighter. He doesn't necessarily have a resume like Canelo Alvarez. But at the same time, Tyson Fury overall, he is only within one weight division. And he's defeated some of the best and the greatest heavyweight fighters of his era. And on top of that, he's undefeated. So it is what it is. And on top of that, he also is the most intelligent, the most skillful boxer, the most complete heavyweight boxer of probably the past 15 years.
In White. And when Tyson beat Vladimir Klitschko, that's when he tested positive for PEDs, which Klitschko reminded Tyson Fury. While Tyson was accusing.
Right, you can allege that all you want to, but even if Tyson Fury was on PEDs, I'm sorry, to me it's just not that big of a deal. And I know a lot of people, they'll say, oh, how can you say that? Like I said, if you're a person on the know that wants to discredit Tyson Fury for allegedly getting caught on PEDs at one point in time, no problem. Stop calling Shane Mosley an all-time great fighter. Stop overall giving Marquez credit overall for some of the victories that he had in his career, especially later on, because it was probably very highly probable that he was on some special magic overall juice. Same with Manny Pacquiao for a certain amount of his career. And I'm just not sure if I'm able to do that.
Alexander Usyk of taking steroids, Klitschko responded to Tyson, and he said, Tyson Fury, you live in a glass house, and someone needs to take away your stones. Wasn't long ago.
And the reason overall why steroids, to me, the reason why they're not really that big of an issue is because I'm really a believer that a lot of these athletes, a lot of boxers, no matter what sport you get into, I'm a believer that a lot of these athletes are on steroids anyway. Just is what it is. I thought Deontay Wilder was possibly on something in his last fight against Tyson Fury. But hey, you never know.
For our fight, where you actually tested positive. Anyone can Google it. Keep it classy. So now we talk about the Deontay Wilder fight and the Dillian White fight. Let's focus on Deontay Wilder for a second. This is where I want to talk to all of you non-black fans. I want to ask you directly. Before Deontay Wilder lost to Tyson Fury, what were you guys all saying about Deontay Wilder?
And this is where Dante overall is going to come up with this point. For a very long time, these guys cried and bitched and moaned and said that Deontay Wilder, that he's a decently great heavyweight, that he's one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. And now that Tyson Fury beat him, and because they don't want Tyson Fury in an all-time great conversation, now they discredit him. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand Dante's point. If you're a person that said that Deontay Wilder was a bum and that all in all that he's not an all-time great heavyweight or that he's not a great heavyweight, then why the hell should Tyson Fury overall get credit for allegedly beating Deontay Wilder if Deontay Wilder was that much of a bum? I get it. It's not the worst point in the world. But I'm a logical and objective thinker, at least overall by my nature. I never overall said that Deontay Wilder was a bum. So if we're just taking a look at things logically and objectively, was Wilder ever going to be a Mike Tyson or a Muhammad Ali or Lennox Lewis with his skill set? No. But what Deontay Wilder basically was, in my view, was somewhat of the George Foreman of the 2010s heading into the 2020s. He was a fighter that relied a lot on his size, relied a lot on his brute strength and his power. He didn't have a plan A, he didn't have a plan B or C. He always was a plan A fighter. He pretty much was a fighter that the majority of the time had to knock you out or had to pound you into submission, usually to win the fight. But he still was great in his own right. That's my opinion about Deontay Wilder. Is he a person that is even as great as what George Foreman was? No. But at the end of the day, Deontay Wilder, he does deserve his spot in history.
You guys remember what you were saying? Because you filled up the comment section on my videos and on the internet. You guys constantly said that Deontay Wilder, he was the worst heavyweight champion of all time. He has zero skills. He's windmill Wilder, etc., etc., etc. You guys even heard me say on...
The question is, Dante, what do you truly believe overall about Deontay Wilder? If you're a person that believes that you're as objective and logical as you truly think you are, which you're not, it just is what it is. If you're an objective and logical thinker, you don't overall go by what fools say. You don't go overall by fool standards. Now, don't get me wrong. Is it sometimes important to bring up certain double standards and say, well, if you believe this, then you should believe this? Is it sometimes important overall to maybe bring up things like that? Absolutely, yes. But Dante, don't overall go on this bullshit to where once upon a time you stated that Deontay Wilder was a great fighter and that he overall had these 10 title defenses and he broke Muhammad Ali's record. And now all of a sudden that Tyson Fury, who's a Caucasoid, and now all of a sudden that he defeated Deontay Wilder, all of a sudden you don't want to give Deontay Wilder that much credit because you want Tyson Fury to be brought down in the process. So come on now, what do you truly think? That's the question, because I remember one time when you put Deontay Wilder at number 4 pound for pound. You, Aki TV, your boy Toy, and Boxing Ego, you all came up with the top 10 pound for pound list, which is apparently, according to you guys, the most logical and objective and, the most usable pound for pound list in all of boxing. You have Deontay Wilder in your top 5 pound for pound. So don't go changing opinions now.
Multiple videos. That Deontay Wilder does not beat you with his skill. He beats you with his will and that right hand.
And yet you predicted Deontay Wilder to win all 3 fights.
Of course, Deontay Wilder was dangerous with that right hand, and it was his equalizer. But you guys have never heard me call Deontay Wilder, pound for pound, one of the best fighters in the world.
That's a lie, and I bet that I can find the video to prove it. But we might do another video on that on another time.
So the question is, when it comes to all of Muhammad Ali's signature wins, do you recall any of those opponents that Muhammad Ali faced, from Sonny Liston to Joe Frazier to George Foreman? Can you recall any boxing fans or writers that was calling these fighters the worst skilled fighters in the heavyweight division, that was calling them bums? And then you have Dillian White. Even though I personally thought that Dillian White was going to do much better than he did in this fight, just based off what...
Yes, because you don't know really that much about boxing, but it is what it is anyway.
Biggest Tyson Fury fans were saying before the fight about Dillian White, we can all agree, even though it was a very impressive win by Tyson Fury, beating a Dillian White is not necessarily the type of win that a fighter gets that makes it clear that Tyson Fury is one of the greatest fighters of all time.
Well, then what does? Because basically you stated that Dillian White, that he would even potentially be a bigger threat than Anthony Joshua or Alexander Usyk. So where's that opinion now? Like I said, more than likely, as I predicted, Dante was not going to be able to help himself. He was going to try to discredit Tyson Fury in some way. Now, don't get me wrong, I understand the point that he's bringing up. But we have no idea if people called Joe Frazier a bum back then. Listen, what I'll tell you what is this. Social media, since it's around today, and almost anyone can get a YouTube channel, or anyone can comment whatever they think, anyone can state their opinion. We have no idea overall what a certain amount of people overall thought about those fighters back then. Now, is that me stating that the majority of the opinions back then would be that those fighters were bums? No. But Deontay Wilder, listen, once again, was he an A-grade skill fighter? No. Neither was George Foreman. George Foreman was not, in my opinion, a person... He was not a boxer that had an A-plus skill set. Go ahead and watch some of George Foreman's fights. He basically swung overall like a big bruising bear. That's not me saying that he had no technique. But George Foreman, let's be real, no one's going to compare him to Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson in terms of, the beauty of boxing and skill. No one's going to do that. So it is what it is. Deontay Wilder, once again, he was basically the George Foreman of his era, the lesser version of George Foreman for his era.
Clearly, the standards and the bar is always set a lot lower when we're talking about a fighter that is not black. How else can we explain Muhammad Ali beating George Foreman, Sonny Liston, and Joe Frazier, and Tyson Fury only had to beat Deontay Wilder and Dillian White?
And Vladimir Klitschko, but notice that he's trying to count out that win because, once again, he wants Tyson Fury to not be remembered as an all-time great heavyweight.
Meanwhile, someone like Lennox Lewis, who's the last heavyweight to become undisputed, not only did he become undisputed, but he defended his title against the dangerous, undefeated, young, hungry Lions, and he beat them all, from David Tua to beating Vitaly Klitschko.
David Tua really wasn't shit. I know a lot of people that they're gonna disagree with me there. David Tua never won one of the official titles, I believe, in his career. David Tua was a good bruiser, but that was really about it. David Tua was not an A-grade boxer.
Which was pretty much a super fight at the time, after Vitaly Klitschko lost to Lennox.
Now, Vitaly Klitschko overall was a very decent boxer, very great boxer, at least for the day. But when it comes down to, like I said, let's not discredit Tyson Fury here. And you can make that bullshit argument all you want to about, well, you guys called them bums, so... they must overall be bums. Yeah, right, but a lot of people overall did that basically because they didn't like the fighters. If someone overall said that in Mayweather's career that he beat a lot of bums like Carlos Baldomir and Zab Judah and Miguel Cotto when he had a couple of losses, would you agree with that? Or would you overall try to put that in proper context? So it's very obvious that Dante, he's not trying to put things in proper context here. He's trying to overall basically discredit Tyson Fury. But listen, I get it to a degree. What I will say is this, once again, I can't put Tyson on the same level, Tyson Fury anyways, on the same level as what Muhammad Ali is at the current moment because Muhammad Ali, in my view, he just accomplished more in his career. But Tyson Fury, in my opinion, he's not super duper 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 far off anyway. What I'll say is this, once again, he's a tier below him in terms of overall the all-time great heavyweights. That's my view.
Lewis, Vitaly, he became a very long reigning heavyweight champion. You see, the truth is, it doesn't matter if people believe what Shakur Stevenson said and they know it's not true. It doesn't matter. They only care that it's being said. And when I say they, I'm mainly talking about ESPN because I told you they liked what Shakur said so much that they decided him saying all of these things deserved its own separate video. Forget about Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the series. They said, oh, we got to do a separate video. Listen to what he just said about Tyson Fury. Now, the question is, will ESPN ever show this type of same energy if Shakur Stevenson does become pound for pound the best fighter in the world? Will they go out of their way to tell the world that Shakur Stevenson is the best fighter in the world? Hell, Shakur is not only the...
I understand overall what you're saying, Mr. Dante's Boxing Nation. But once again, just as you mentioned earlier, Tyson Fury being in a glass house, you also are in a glass house as well, sir. Have you ever gave a Caucasian or Latino fighter within this generation as being credited overall as debatably in the greatest of all time conversation, or even as an all-time great fighter? Every single one that I've seen, you talk about, they're somewhat overrated or overstated. They have the complexion for the protection. So let's be real, you pull the same shit tactics as well. Because basically you're an angry little kid when it comes down to it. That's overall the mindset that you have. And you're basically going to say, oh, well, you don't like me? Well, then fuck you. Basically, I'm going to treat you overall with the same energy. And sometimes that's necessary. But if you're going to be a commentator like this, you have to have usually mostly objective and logical content. And Dante does not do that.
Best fighter in the world. Shakur is already one of the greatest fighters of all time. Is ESPN going to say that? Is the Zone going to say that? All right.
Well, we'll see about that. But once again, don't get me wrong. I don't think that you should never bring that up when it comes down to it. I think overall that if ESPN obviously, does not have the same energy, that's a good thing overall to bring up. But once again, Dante, if you're complaining about their standards, don't have those same standards, just somewhat in an opposite way, because you're trying to do basically the same thing that they're doing, but overall basically just covering black fighters in a better light. This is what I always say about Dante's Boxing Nation. All he is basically the BET version of boxing. That's all he is. He's the BET overall pro-black cult version of boxing. That's all he is. He complains about how ESPN and his own, and especially these main Caucasian-owned media, that, they don't cover black fighters as well. You don't cover Latino and Caucasoid fighters that well. You don't overall do that. You don't cover any other demographic of fighter that well. In fact, more often at the time, you're usually trying to tear them down more often than what you are lifting them up and being a logical and objective commentator. I understand your point, Dante. I understand it's not the worst point in the world. But if you're going to bitch and moan overall about them doing that, and basically if you're going to throw stones, you better make sure that you're not doing the same shit.
Any of these old media members going to say this about Shakur Stevenson? Are they going to give him any additional points for actually saying what he said about Tyson Fury? Are they going to take that into consideration when they see how dominant Shakur Stevenson is? Assuming he gets past Oscar Valdez and puts on a very impressive performance, which we believe that he will. And then he does this.
I believe that Shakur Stevenson will beat Oscar Valdez. I believe that more than likely it probably will be an 8 rounds to 4 performance for Shakur Stevenson by decision. Wouldn't be surprised if there was a stoppage in there. But Oscar Valdez, he is no joke as well, so we'll see what happens.
Against even bigger names. But we already know, it is a known fact that can be proven just by paying attention to what's going on in boxing, that when it comes to fighters on the coincidental list, the bar is set much, much higher than just beating a Deontay Wilder and a Dillian White to be considered one of the greatest fighters of all time. Remember, ESPN...
So basically what is Dante saying here? He doesn't believe that Tyson Fury is really that great of a fighter. And he's not even putting Tyson Fury, not only is he not saying that he's the greatest of all time, which, whatever, that's your view. I would not put him as the greatest heavyweight of all time either, at least as of yet. But he does not even believe that he's one of the greatest fighters of all time. But remember, when Deontay Wilder had all those title defenses, and he really had nobody on his resume, he still pretty much has nobody on his resume, besides that of Luis Ortiz. Basically, he was calling Deontay Wilder, or these guys were basically saying that Deontay Wilder, that he's a top 10 heavyweight of all time, and that he'll eventually overall prove that he's the greatest heavyweight of this era. But now that Tyson Fury came to the top, to the cream of the crop, And basically, he did not expect that. Basically, he has to do damage control.
And is the same network that said Gennady Golovkin.
But once again, isn't it interesting? Because the point that he made overall about Muhammad Ali, now don't get me wrong, I too would put Muhammad Ali above Tyson Fury as the greater fighter, just in terms of what they accomplished. And, of course, if you want to say skill set as well, no issue there. Muhammad Ali was one of the most skilled and athletically gifted champions of all time in boxing, period. But at the end of the day, it's so funny because I can make the same point overall if I really wanted to. Let's say if I wanted to compare Floyd Mayweather Jr. and Sugar Ray Leonard, I could say, you know what? Well, the bar has to be set much higher than Manny Pacquiao and Miguel Cotto. Because those fighters, all in all, they weren't as talented or as skilled as what a Roberto Duran or Tommy Hearns or Marvin Hagler were. So Sugar Ray Leonard, in my view, is way above Floyd Mayweather Jr. I could say something like that. But yet Dante's Boxing Nation, he doesn't talk about that way with Floyd Mayweather Jr. Now, do I actually believe that all the fighters that I just named are way, 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 way more talented than some of the fighters that Floyd beat? No, not necessarily, at least not all the time in his career. What we have to take a look at the great fighters that they defeated for their day, as long as they were high-quality fighters, and on top of that, what they accomplished and how skilled they were. We have to take a look at the whole package.
One of the greatest fighters of all time. That was before he even fought Canelo 2 times. And just like Shakur Stevenson said right now that Tyson Fury is one of the greatest heavyweights of all time, he would beat Muhammad Ali. Remember, guys, there was a time way before Roman Chocolatito got knocked out and before anyone really even knew who he was, and he didn't have too many accomplishments. Old media started calling this man pound for pound the best fighter in the world, and Floyd Mayweather agreed with old media. It was funny because
Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, one thing at least I'll say about him, when he was number one pound for pound, he was a 4-weight division champion, and then eventually he went on to defeat some of the best champions of his weight classes. So at least it wasn't completely unbelievable that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez would have been ranked number one at the time.
He asked Floyd Mayweather, who is pound for pound the best fighter?
And Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, in my opinion, even though he does have his faults, here and there, he is a decently great fighter. In my opinion, he is certainly one of the greatest, at least fighters overall, that is within one of those very, very small weight classes
in the world. And I remember Floyd Mayweather, he said, what's the dude's name? What's that guy's name? Chocolatito? Yeah, him, Chocolatito Gonzalez. The way Floyd Mayweather said it, there's a very good chance that Floyd Mayweather had never even watched a Roman Gonzalez fight. But everyone was...
Floyd does not disagree overall with quote-unquote old media. Floyd Mayweather Jr. states whatever his opinion is. Floyd is not one of these fighters, all in all, that basically kowtows, kowtows basically to some other people's opinion because he's afraid of what people are going to say. Floyd basically states whatever the hell he thinks or what he wants to say.
He was pound for pound the best fighter in the world. So it's almost like some people, they look at it like, oh, well, you guys have already gave me the answer to the test because this is who you guys are telling us is the best. At the end of the day, I told you guys, Shakur...
So basically, you're insulting Floyd Mayweather Jr.'s intelligence. Basically, you're stating that when he said that Roman Chocolatito Gonzalez, that he overall was the number one pound for pound, that Floyd overall either did not have the courage or he did not have the intellect overall, the individuality to claim that someone else was the number one pound for pound fighter. Right now, Floyd Mayweather Jr. isn't going along with the narrative. He does not claim that Canelo is the number one pound for pound. Now, do I think that maybe there's somewhat of a deeper meaning behind that? Yes, I do, but it is what it is, And also when it comes to, Floyd, he's not claiming that Canelo's the number one pound for pound. I believe that he claims that Terrence Crawford is. So Floyd, once again, whether I agree with him or disagree with him, one thing I'll at least give him is this. He at least states whatever he truly is thinking in his mind.
Stevenson, he pretty much went out of his way to not only praise Tyson Fury, but say he would beat Muhammad Ali. And he's already one of the greatest fighters of all time. He doesn't have to become undisputed like Lennox Lewis. He doesn't have to take on the young, hungry lions like Jared Anderson, the undefeated mandatory like Joe Joyce. In other words...
I'm sorry, but Joe Joyce and Jared Anderson, even though those guys are two of the best heavyweights in the world, what, you think that Tyson Fury just has to defeat everyone in the heavyweight division? Did Andre Ward defeat every single one of the light heavyweights in the division? Did he defeat, James DeGale later on? Did he defeat, overall the Durrell brothers? Did he defeat Adonis Stevenson? Like, cut the bullshit, man. Come on. We all know Tyson Fury is a decently great fighter. He's an all-time great fighter. If you have Vladimir Klitschko, Dillian White, and Deontay Wilder on your resume, you had a damn pretty good career.
He doesn't have to do things that Muhammad Ali had to do. Because just saying that these guys or no one can beat him is already good enough. That's how good it is being on the hope list. You don't even have to prove it. You can just say, or someone can say for you, that Tyson, he doesn't have to become undisputed because he would beat the winner of Joshua Usyk. He would beat Jared Anderson.
He doesn't have to become undisputed, but yet this is the same channel that debated that Deontay Wilder was always the greater fighter than Anthony Joshua, and still would debate that he's the greater fighter than Anthony Joshua, even though Deontay Wilder has never held 3 belts in that division like Anthony Joshua and has nowhere near the resume of him. Okay.
Joe Joyce. And whoever else is climbing up the ladder, he would beat them. So he gets a pass. He doesn't even have to fight them.
Once again, it's very interesting. Do you keep that same energy when Deontay Wilder was fighting all those bums coming off the street, like Johan Duapis, overall Bermain Stavern, Malik Scott, all those bums that were just coming off overall on this record? Like, come on. All of a sudden, you didn't think those fighters were bums, but all of a sudden, Tyson Fury, he ends up defeating some of the best heavyweights of his era, and all of a sudden, they're bums. All of a sudden, you change your mind now. Get the fuck out of here.
So if that's the case, we should already be calling Shakur Stevenson pound for pound. He shouldn't even have to fight Oscar Valdez or anyone else. Because we already believe that he can beat almost anyone that they put in front of him, right?
I understand overall what you're saying, Dante. It's not the worst point in the world, but at least Tyson Fury is somewhat proven. If Tyson Fury overall had not defeated Deontay Wilder and Vladimir Klitschko and Dillian White, there would not be a lot of people that would be saying the things that they are about Tyson Fury today. So even though I understand your argument, it's not the best argument in the world because Shakur Stevenson has never beaten an A-grade fighter in his career. So come on, man.
But we know what time it is. Someone like Shakur Stevenson is not going to get that luxury. As young as he is still, an Oscar Valdez win is bigger than a Dillian White win because he's undefeated. He's a 2-division champ.
Well, sure, I would debate that, but once again, that's somewhat, in a way, you discrediting the win that Tyson Fury ended up having. Once again, you thought that Dillian White had a very decent chance to defeat Tyson Fury. Where's all this credit that you were allegedly going to give Tyson Fury? It ain't going to happen because he hates Tyson Fury's guts. He hates that man.
And none of you guys that called Deontay Wilder all of the things you called him, called Oscar Valdez any of these things, right? Exactly. So with that being said, I'm going to wrap this video up. That's all I got for now, guys. I'm on to the next one.
But anyways, I pretty much overall knew what DontesBoxingNation was going to say in this video. Once again, he tries to discredit Tyson Fury's career because not only does he know that Tyson Fury is an all-time great fighter, he does not want him to be in the greatest of all-time conversation, and he's doing the same thing with Canelo Alvarez. That's why overall those two fighters, he hates them so goddamn much. He looks at those two fighters, he's like, I'm tired of these goddamn crackers. They gotta go. He's so tired of those two fighters, man. But anyways, overall, that's pretty much about it for this video. I'll talk to y'all later. Hopefully y'all have a wonderful day today, and we'll see what ends up happening with Tyson Fury's career next. But anyways, that's really about it for today. Thanks so much for watching. I'll talk to y'all later.